Hi, I'm Wes Waugh, and we're here in my home studio in Boone, North Carolina with the Joe's Test Studio crew. And we're going to take a look today at what's commonly called the wet into wet method of painting watercolors. Now, this method has many virtues, which we're going to talk about a few, and also poses some unique challenges, particularly for those folks who are just now trying this approach or maybe new to watercolor. One of the things that we are able to achieve with wet into wet painting is a very dense and rich color saturation. We have a high concentration of pigment, and one of the neat things about it is when we put that pigment on wet paper, we get beautiful soft edge transitions, which is very natural looking. And it's a particularly good method for painting atmospheric landscapes, which, as many folks know, is one of my favorite subjects. Some of the other things that happen with the wet into wet approach are what we call gradations of color, meaning that the pigments move through the fluid medium on the paper and produce beautiful differential shades. We also look at something that happens with wet into wet that's very unique to watercolor, and that is the mineral precipitations. That means the chemicals and the minerals in the paints actually act together with one another and produce some things that there's no way we could produce on our own. So you get some very beautiful effects. In general, many people are lured to watercolor in the first place because they see incredible results from other artists' attempts at wet into wet, and of course they want to try it. Probably your first 2 to 3 attempts at this method are not going to give you the exact results you hope for. But with time and some patience and practice, you're going to be well on your way to kind of getting over the initial hurdles and getting to that promised land of beautiful, rich color, pigment gradations, and all kinds of neat interactions. There are several things we can do right up front in terms of preparation to avoid some of the common problems that folks run into when painting wet into wet. We see here that I'm set up with a sheet of bright white Kilimanjaro paper on a piece of gator board. I've got my paper propped up with a little homemade matte board, foam board rather, triangle that's taped with artist tape so that I can adjust the flow of the water downhill to 3 different sizes, from a low to a high steep grade. My instructor and mentor Chinky Chi showed me how to construct that early on, and I've had that one probably close to 12 or so years now. One of the things that we want to ensure right off the bat is that our paper is completely saturated with water and that we have moist pigments. The first one, saturation. We have to realize that in order for this paper to become completely saturated, it takes time. For a quarter sheet, rather a half sheet like this, I would allow at least 15 to 20 minutes where the paper is soaked in water. And yes, you can put it in the bathtub, but I actually find the brush wetting process kind of meditative, and it relaxes me to begin the process of painting, and it enables you to see where dry spots occur. So let's be clear, it takes a while for the fibers to open up and absorb the water. What's the reason that this is so important? We want a consistent playing field when we start the wet and wet process. We don't want some spots in our paper drier than other spots so that they absorb water less in some places and pigment less in some places than others. Let's talk about the palette. You can see here that the paints in my palette are very, very moist, and that I've also prepared some puddles of paint that we're going to use in just a minute that are very intense in pigment concentration. One of the challenges and problems that I see occur in students learning this method is that their paints are too dry and they spend a lot of time trying to massage the top of the paint to get enough color off of it. So really what they end up with is more of a tint, a lot of water and a little bit of pigment. And you can see here that because the palette rather, is very moist, almost wet of toothpaste consistency, I can pick up a very deep, rich blend of this burnt sienna and add it to my water mixture. So those are 2 things we can do right off the bat to ensure that we don't run into some problems pretty quickly down the road. One of the problems, or rather most of the problems with this technique occur in the early stages of the painting, either inadequate preparation or during what I call the foundation wash stage, which is usually the first 15 to 30 minutes of the painting process. What we're trying to do in foundation washes is to just establish our main shapes with the proper value of color and pigment. What happens is sometimes that we get very absorbed in that process. We're thinking about a lot of different things. We're thinking about our color patterns, our color harmony that we want to use. We're thinking about values that we need to incorporate into the design of the painting. So in some ways we feel that our brain is being pulled in multiple directions. And what happens then is that we're forgetting about one major component, and that's the water dynamic of the painting. Meaning that we, without knowing what we're really doing, introduce more and more water into the surface of the painting as we try to make that color and value happen. We really, in a sense, create sort of a rice paddy effect on the surface of our painting. The pigment floats to the top, and then we sometimes make our third mistake. Remember again, we've got to prepare, we've got to saturate our paper, and then the next mistake we often make is way too much brush work in those early stages. A lot of that brush work occurs, we're trying to fix those problems of flooding. We're trying to take a damp brush and mop up that water, and what happens is we start moving pigment around, dispersing pigment, and we end up muddying and dulling the chroma of the paint. So sometimes we do see folks that after the first 30 or 40 minutes fall into somewhat of a state of despair over this method. And I try to get them to take heart and realize that once we understand some of the dynamics going on, a lot of these issues that they're running into are going to be controlled. Lastly, one thing I always remind folks, in the words of the great Edgar Whitney, is to slow down, relax, breathe, and don't rush the process. When we start trying to replicate our value drawing or our color patterns, naturally our anxiety level goes up. And so there again we begin to move faster, and we begin to not pay as much attention to things like how much water we're introducing onto the paper when we put down our pigments. So let's take an actual look at how we can control some of these factors. We see that this paper is completely saturated, and it's been sitting here for at least half an hour, probably a little bit longer. A good piece of paper that's saturated will flop down like a piece of wallpaper that's ready to be glued to the wall, in a sense. We next want to remove, we make sure there are no bubbles coming up. We want to remove the excess water, and I am a big proponent of cotton towels rather than paper towels for a couple reasons. One, it's much better for the environment, and they tend to be at the right level of absorbency. I'm not really against folks using paper towels, but one of the things that can happen with a paper towel blotter is that you actually can pull too much water back out of the paper. We want our paper, when we're ready to paint, to be similar to a soaked sponge that has been given one good squeeze. Okay? Still has enough water for us to create a capillary action effect, which is a physics term, meaning that the paper is going to pull that pigment down into the surface. Okay? But it's not so wet that it floats pigment, and it's not so dry that the pigment doesn't flow into the paper well. So let's lightly roll the excess water off our paper, and I suggest that you collect a quiver of old white towels that quickly become stained with watercolor and lightly roll across the surface. You're going to see just a slight glisten, and one way to tell if your paper is the correct degree of wetness is to take the backs of your fingers and it just feels slightly damp. So there again, we really should probably call this process wet into damp to be more accurate, but that term never has stuck. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this very important towel and I'm going to sling it over my shoulder, sort of like Linus, so that I get reminded that I need to control the water in my brush. Now, what I want to demonstrate next is we're going to consider that we would want to paint, say, a middle ground mountain range. Something that's sort of in the center of the painting that needs to be of a medium value at least. Not too close to us, but not too far away where it turns cool and blue and pale. I'm going to prepare two different areas. And again, my brush right now is damp but not soaked. And again, you see the intensity of the pigment that I have prepared in my palette. Now, I've picked up the water in the paint. I slowly damp the base of the brush on the towel. What that does is it pulls that little bit of extra moisture out of the brush and leaves a lot of rich pigment. Let's say that our top layer up here, look at that, we get a nice deep cerulean yellow. I'm using a Cheap Joe's Magic Dragon Kolinsky Sable 1-inch brush. That was a mouthful. Wonderful brush because it, again, the natural fibers, the Kolinsky hairs, absorb a tremendous amount of water and pigment so that you don't have to stop and reload. So we've got a patch of really nice cerulean yellow. I'm going to totally clean out my brush, dry it off quickly, still a little yellow in there. And I'm going to go now to this pool of burnt sienna and pick up that intense pool of pigment. Again, dampen off the base of the brush and paint a lower region. You can see that I'm able to go clear across this half sheet of Kilimanjaro paper with a nice uniform wash of pure clean color. You can also begin to see a little bit of the effects of the wet paper pulling that pigment in various directions, which creates some of the nice effects that we achieve, particularly when painting mountain ranges and transitions from fields to mountains and that type of thing. Now, the next phase is pretty important when we want to actually start creating the shapes. We've got a foundation wash. We're going to call this a summer mountain up here, and we're going to call this a winter mountain down here, using the more neutralized burnt sienna, the earth pigment, and the brighter yellow up on top for the warmer months. Completely damp brush on my towel, and we're going to pick up some Prussian blue. Notice again, taking that extra moisture off. I'm going to lower the angle a little bit so this doesn't bleed quite as much. And because I have a high concentration of pigment and not too much water, I'm going to paint a nice dense section of color right in here. Now, one of the things about getting our values right, the degree of lightness and darkness we need in our shapes, is again understanding, of course, what pigments create different levels of lightness and darkness in our shapes, but also getting the paint and the pigment on the paper in a deep enough concentration so that we actually are creating depth and darkness in that swatch. So I did this properly. We're still seeing that we get a nice bleed effect, but notice that the Prussian blue is not running everywhere out of control. Let's go and take one more step and do things not quite as effectively. Let's leave a little water in the brush, pick up some Prussian blue, maybe give it a quick damp, but not really pay too much attention, because that's what happens when we start speeding up and getting nervous. We quit paying attention to the level of water in our brush, and again we start moving toward that rice paddy. Now there again, you immediately see a difference. Not necessarily a bad difference, but in many cases, you don't want this much diffusion in your mixture, because what's going to happen now is as watercolor dries, it's going to dry much lighter than it appears on the paper, which is another challenge with the wet into wet technique. We've got to take notice that we have to lay down value a little bit darker than we think we need it. What's going to happen now as this dries, you can see that this is running a little more, and this will continue to bleed over the next 10 or 15 minutes in different directions. And when we check for value, you've probably heard that we need to see through color by squinting to actually see the lightness and darkness characteristics of what we've got down. Now, one of the problems is that a lot of instructors don't follow up and tell people actually how to squint. So people wrinkle up their face, but they still have their eyes open. It doesn't work too well. So one of the things that I want to outline for you is that when we squint to look at value, that we really close our eyes, sort of like we do when a child has told us to close our eyes and not look, but we really are going to. And we look down, and you can see now a significant value difference between these two swatches. Let's carry this process down into our winter area. And remember again, what we're laying down the foundation for would be similar to what we would want a middle range mountain to be. And even though we're not making the shape of the mountain, that's kind of the look we're going for in the demo. I'm going to pick up some ultramarine blue. These are American Journey colors, good, deep, rich watercolor mixtures that have a great consistency for doing wet into wet work. And this is also a Cheap Joe's porcelain palette, which I switched to a while back and absolutely love. It's very easy to clean, doesn't move around on your tabletop. And again, you can see I am able to strike all the way across the paper with a nice clean wash. And now we begin to see some of those interesting effects of the wet into wet technique. We see the two colors blending together to create some unique gradations and actually diversity in the colors all around the edges. We see that this wetter swatch has bled all the way down into the white paper because, again, we didn't damp off our brush as carefully. This has a nice kind of feathered edge, which you can actually use to simulate middle distance mountain trees. Nice soft transition from the sky to the tree. And we're getting the same kind of effect here. These two colors are more granulating, with burnt sienna being an earth color, a mineral pigment, and then ultramarine blue granulates well as also. So creates a nice texture in these two spots. So that kind of gives us a starting point. As long as we continue to pay attention to keeping our brush loaded with pigment, and more pigment than water, when we go to that wet surface, we're not going to lose control. One of the things I hear most often after students have attempted this and gotten frustrated is, I tried this, but I just can't control it. There's no way I can paint wet into wet. Or I love wet into wet effects, but watercolor sure doesn't like me. Some folks swear off watercolor forever because they have problems with this technique. But I hope you've seen that there are a few things we can do to head off those problems at the pass and end up being able to move forward into the development of the shapes in our painting and to get to that fun point of putting in all those finishing details that we love to do.